Welcome to Professor's Corner. I'm joined here with Zach, and we're discussing applied ethics in public policy. Our conversation here is on the pressing topic of political economy. We're going to be looking at different topics this week, but in particular we're going to focus our time together around the stewardship of the environment. The point being that within the basic morality, the idea of stewardship is one of those platitudes that any society has to hold. It's the relationship of human beings to the environment, but that platitude has to be interpreted. And that's where the controversy emerges between Christian and secular sort of theories. So with that in mind, let's start with basically the biblical view of the environment. Now, of course, there's so much that could be done here, and the point I want to get is I don't want to just proof text. I want folks to use biblical verses and principles that capture the continuity of God's mind.
Generate an overarching theme.
It's right. God's mind underlies all of the verses, because remember, those are people operating in cultures and different things too, so you don't necessarily have to take it on face value. You try to see what's going on underneath the text. It's not hidden, it's there, but you have to be careful in your interpretation. So we'll jump on the environment. The creation narratives immediately come to mind, right? And there's really kind of four ideas that I want to capture real quick.
Okay.
Is the idea that God's sovereign creative purposes are revealed in the creative narrative, and that human beings are placed in the center of God's created order. So we're going to, that's the part of a metaphysic that's going to be scraped away in terms of secular thinking. Also, if you think about within the creation narrative, Genesis 1:28 talks about human beings subduing. Mm-hmm. I think it's important to understand that usually gets criticized as dominating, exploiting.
Yeah.
That's not what the Hebrew term actually is getting at. Mm-hmm. It's more this idea of the stewardship.
Right.
You can't just abuse God's creation. So it stipulates, subduing stipulates stewardship as our relationship to nature. And then, of course, the fourth area in this is the whole idea of the fall and the sin, and how that complicates our relating. May end up that we end up misusing the environment, violating our stewardship.
Always falling short of the ideal.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's kind of what we're looking at here in this session. Now, also, Zach, we've talked about in the different weeks this idea of deconstructing new liberalism. It started with trying to, in a minimal way, scrape away metaphysical, religious. It wasn't just religious, but anything metaphysical. They tried to scrape all that away, and they created this two-tier morality: a very, very small basic morality, very large, expansive realm of the ethical, where there are many truths but no truth. Mm-hmm. They found out the minimalist interpretation of those core values in the basic social morality were not enough. They had to be borrowing from that outer circle to get content to interpret. Well, that meant that they either had to acknowledge that there was a rationality in that outer circle, mm-hmm. which they heretofore didn't want to do, or they had to find some other mechanism by which to allow it without acknowledging the truth or validity of those views. So they came up with the pluralist approach, right? And they made it prescriptive pluralist, a normative value. And so now we're going to be dealing with various interpretations of this concept of stewardship. So when we deconstruct, the first thing we want to do, and it may not always be evident when you look in the literature, again, we're trying to learn how to read and not so much how to create the argument, although we get a little practice that along the way. So the first thing is, when you're reading an article, and you were working extensively on this, on the readings here as on the environment, is to see what is going on metaphysically.
Right.
And then we want to see what's involved in the social morality. Well, there we've already acknowledged it's going to be stewardship. We might want to take a look at what social ideals are implicit. Now, of course, in this course, we're really working a lot on new liberalism, because that's the air we breathe. That's the environment. That's where you as students are going to be operating when you are doing public policy at whatever level, the federal level, the state level, the local level, or in a nonprofit organization. You are going to be governed or have to respond to the new liberalism. So you need to learn it, because that's your effectiveness as a policy specialist depends upon your ability to talk about this. So So we have to do a little reconstruction. Once we've recognized the social concept, then we will now begin to try to see, is the Christian idea more humanly satisfying than the secular notions? Because if they've depleted all the, if we're part of God's created universe, and we're His created nature, and we have within us a desire for Him and a worship for Him, if you deplete some of that humanness, it's going to be unsatisfying, you would think. And so it's very subtle, but we need to kind of get to that point that makes people feel like, oh, the Christian view, I don't like that metaphysics, but yeah, it is more satisfying. Okay, so that's kind of what we're trying to do.
Okay.
So when we're talking first here about the first step is the metaphysics. And we'll move along here in the interest of time a little bit, but we're looking at what might be brought into play. So there could be many things in the environment debate. Any society that wants to exist will have a shared morality and it will have to include something about man's relationship to the environment. So we first have to kind of take and decipher, is it a minimalist strategy or a pluralist strategy? Well, the papers that we're reading now more than not are usually the pluralist strategy, and that indeed is what you read with the reading this week. And it's there's usually a repudiation of the received view of stewardship that's profoundly influenced by the Christian metaphysics. It doesn't have to be a Christian metaphysic interpretation on the received view of stewardship, but it in the Western culture it is. And so it's that biblical view, the centrality of human beings at God's creation, the command to subdue, that is to be a steward. Those are the sort of things that are criticized, as you recognized in the readings. And so what the author that we're looking at this week is basically trying to take and look at, allowing the outer circle, the personal ideals, the cultural heritage of various kinds to interpret this very basic, rudimentary, undefined, indeterminate notion of stewardship. Okay. So the fundamental intuition is the stewardship or our responsibility to nature. In other words, within the Christian view, human purposes of nature were to eschew poverty, to eliminate disease, or to make back-breaking work more limited, to do away with that. There's no problem with our attempt to control nature when that was the sort of issue. But with the science technology comes along, and the birth of science, particularly Baconian, Francis Bacon in the Renaissance period, in the 1550s, it was to control nature. And of course, the ideal would be, in the social sciences, to control human nature, right? So along the way, this idea about control nature became the sort of thing that, if you've repudiated the Christian worldview of man in the center of the universe, or if it's been misapplied, then you can understand why certain folks, romantic folks, would, subjectivists would have a problem with that view of relationship of human beings to creation, to the universe. And also, this view, the Christian view was very supportive of what we might call today middle-class frame values of clean water, clean air, uncontaminated food. But stewardship still needs to be interpreted. And if it's not going to be the Christian interpretation, then what interpretation is it going to be? That's where we engaged in the deconstruction to see of new liberalism, to see what they have that supplants it. Well, we can, to group here easily, we can call it kind of the romantic and the rationalistic pole, rationalistic being that basic social morality, romantic being everything else. We can kind of put that together, and we can see that the rationalist turn in science is rejected. In other words, more science isn't what certain people want. They're pointing out to where technology and science have now creating abuses, right? And so that's not where people are headed. If anything, they're more primitive and back to nature type of understanding. And in fact, the Romantic poet from the late 18th, early 19th century, Lord Byron, captures this kind of pastoral understanding of nature that I think is that the Romantic is trying to capture when they try to explain their relationship, or the New Liberalism, insofar as they're New Romantics. It's this idea that from the famous nature poem, there's a stanza that says, "I love not man the worst, but nature more," right? It's that type of thing, and that's what you pick up on when you're reading in the articles about Lynn White. Now, he was a professor at Princeton in medieval studies, but he made this claim basically in a seminal paper in '67 that Christianity is responsible for the environmental crisis. But I read that paper again and again, and towards the end, he doesn't want to throw out the metaphysics, and he doesn't want to necessarily throw out Christianity. He takes Francis Assisi and he reinterprets Francis Assisi, and he says, basically, he had a notion of humility, and he wants to read that as equating animal and natural creation with human beings, right? That gets the point of keeping, kind of rethinking Christianity, so to speak, without keeping sort of the genesis, some of the connotations. Right. But that's not really exactly what Francis Assisi is doing. He's actually, it's true, he has a humbleness, a humility, but that's what's causing him to reevaluate the relationship. But he's not giving up on the centrality of God's creation, of human beings in God's creation. What he's saying is, he's reminding us what our true responsibilities are in our stewardship of the environment, insofar as we're redeemed individuals in relationship to God. Willis Jenkins is a paper that we've taken a look at, and he critiques White's legacy, and even though people have moved beyond White, it still haunts, it's still in the background intellectually. And the interesting thing to note in his is that he wants to address in the pluralistic way and allow for multiple moral communities as they engage complex environmental questions. And that would include sort of religious cultures such as Buddhism or Hinduism, right? Those are more or less pantheistic, at least Buddhism is, with regard to what gives nature its importance is that we become one with nature, right? Nothing distinguishable between us. So we have to look at some of the vulnerabilities is the next part of the reconstruction. We've kind of played around with we know the social construction, we know the rudimentary basic core value that's it, but we have to look at the way this gets interpreted. To make it very simply, utilitarianism isn't going to work in this interpretation. And the reason is because it's trying to maximize social happiness. And all you have to do is jigger the calculations, and you can justify plowing fields for residential development, or you can have the destruction of virgin forests, for example. It's in the calculation, right?
And this is where utilitarians would differ on their. There's no one type of utilitarian necessarily.
That's right. That's going to be to our advantage, because in the same way we're accused, of multiple interpretations of the Bible, we could take utilitarians, or we take secular normative theories further and say, well, utilitarians differ from Kantians. How so? Well, the Kantian likes their ideal is what? It's the autonomous.
The autonomous agent.
Rational agent. Very sophisticated in their thinking, right? But trees, can you see trees as no.
Therefore, they would be excluded.
The moral
community.
They excluded from the moral.
Do whatever we want.
Exactly. And so neither of those systems work well. Now, that's not to say there aren't Kantians that try to address environmental issues, or utilitarians that try to address environmental issues, right? But they don't fit. They certainly struggle within sort of the more romantic notion that seems to be quasi-transcendental or religious or something like that. And so that's what we want to watch for when we're reading Jenkins. What's going on, and when does he bring those ideas in, and how does he find those are acceptable? What does he do to these other theories, and what are not acceptable? This is where the meat is, so to speak, in terms of our ability, our apologetic in public policy. Okay, if we're going to engage, that's where we've got to be.
Great.
So we might say that in terms of the human being's relationship to nature, summarizing, we can find that the secular ethical theories are deficient. the religious enlightened metaphysics dissolves human existence. You know what I mean by that?
No, I'm not exactly clear now.
Okay, so Christianity begins with the self, do unto others as you do unto self. It still keeps the self in the picture. Buddhism differs from Christianity on this point in that it annihilates the self. It gets rid of desires, those things that are our humanness. And the idea is therefore we become enlightened by becoming disinterested. That doesn't explain the next step though, about how we get then interested in a compassionate kind of sympathetic way towards our stewardship responsibilities. All we are within Buddhism is disinterested beings, non-existent selves, blended into a larger self or a larger universe of abstraction. So it's not going to be satisfying. Christians need to review, I think here, the forgotten teachings regarding human beings' responsibility in nature. I think it is good to go back and look at Francis Assisi and some of these folks in that tradition of volunteerism to see what it was that they are having that the rationalistic trends within Christianity were lacking, right? Nothing wrong with doing that. In fact, that's what Lynn White did, but he ended up, in a way, distorting, I think, the faith of Francis Assisi. Virtue has less to do with the actions towards nature than a characteristic trait that permits our appreciation of creation. We are not indifferent towards it when we're humble. We still have a self. I like what C.S. Lewis said in terms of this. He said, humility is not thinking less of the self, but thinking of oneself less. So if you think of yourself less amount of time, but you don't devalue yourself, you're going to appreciate the beauty and the aesthetics of creation. And
thinking about others more too.
Right, and that virtue humility is more a change of our being than our actions. And our being changes our actions. And we begin to see properly ourselves in relationship to in a well-developed sense of beauty and our understanding of God, and a fuller sense of our worship of the Creator. So I think that's kind of where we're at. And now what we've sort of done is we've kind of deconstructed the piece, and we tried to, along the way at the same time, build up the Christian view. Make sense?
Yeah.
Good.